Hi, my name is MacLaine Diemer, and this was a presentation that I was originally supposed to give to the New England section of the SMPTE organization. Unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties, I wasn't able to use any of my slides and my audiovisual guides. And so I'm re-recording this for posterity and for future reference for anyone who was at that meeting or was curious and wanted to see the presentation as it was supposed to happen. So this is called High Score, Writing Music for Video Games. And my name is MacLaine Diemer, as I mentioned. And first I'll talk a little bit about me. So yes, MacLaine is my first name. It's a question I get asked by just about everybody that I meet, and so it's helpful to kind of square that away immediately. In a previous life, as a young man, I attended the Berklee College of Music in Boston. I studied things like songwriting and synthesis and studio production. Anything that was interesting to me, I took at least a semester of, if not two. I was kind of non-committal to any one particular major and ended up kind of graduating with a smorgasbord of stuff. My initial dream was to be a rock star, and here's a picture of me dreaming. This was a band called Bang Camaro, and we had some, a pretty solid regional success in the Northeast, and we're able to do some touring across the country. And it was a fun time, as you can see by this picture. I want to point out the individual with in the front that is getting the beer poured into his mouth. It's pretty indicative of what a typical show was like. When it was fun, it was great, and when it wasn't, it was bad. But this is an example of the good times. We're all having a great time there. Interestingly enough, the person who's drinking that beer or being assisted in drinking that beer is a friend of mine. His name is Bryn, and he still to this day is a video game programmer. And my relationship with him in this band was actually how I got my foot in the door in the video game industry. I'd kind of always had it in the back of my mind that it was something I was interested in as a career, but I thought that, I should probably try to be a rock star first, because you never know until you try. And we had some good times, but we never made enough money, really, is all it came down to. And as I kind of got into my late 20s, I thought, I don't know if this is the type of life that I want to keep up into my 30s. So why don't I try something else? And at the time, my friend Bryn there, the beer drinker, he was working at a studio in Boston called Harmonix Music Systems, and this was in 2008 or so, and this was kind of right at the peak of the music game phenomenon. So if you remember, or if you have kids or grandkids that were interested at the time in a game called Guitar Hero and Rock Band, those were both games that were made by this studio, Harmonix, and it was an exciting time to be a game developer in Boston. Unfortunately, the scene there has kind of calmed down a little bit. It was a lot more promising about 10, 12 years ago that it was going to be this hub in the Northeast, and especially on the East Coast, for game development, and it never quite panned out that way. But Harmonix is still around. They're still making games to this day, which is cool. So yeah, that was kind of how I got my foot in the door. Here are a few of the titles, high-profile titles that I've been fortunate enough to work on. The first one was the Beatles Rock Band that was released in 2009. A dream come true for a Beatles fan. I mean, working on that game was just so special, and I was thrilled to find out that was going to be my first project when I got hired. I decided that if I never made another game in the industry again, I'd be more than proud to have my name attached to that one and somehow a part of the legacy of the Beatles. Fortunately, it was only the start of my career, not the end. So I worked on Rock Band 3 while I was at Harmonix. And in 2010, I left that studio and I moved out of Boston to live in Seattle and work for a studio called ArenaNet. And they continue to make a game called Guild Wars 2, which is probably the highest profile. I don't know if it's highest profile, but it's certainly the longest running project I've been on. I started working on it in 2010. It's 2020 now, and I continue to work on it all the time. It's really working on that project changed my life. It's given me the opportunity to do what I've always wanted to do, which is wake up every day and write music. And so I'm very thankful that project came into my life. And then my most recent project is a game called Crucible, which was released earlier this year by Amazon. Amazon, about 5 years ago, decided they were going to try to break into video games and spun up a bunch of internal game development studios. I would say if you're really curious, Google it, because it's an interesting story. They've had some mixed results with their game development, mostly on the not so great side of things. And Crucible, unfortunately, falls into that category. It was released. It was kind of a big flop. And the nature of that game is that it requires online servers to handle players logging on and playing against each other all over the world. Which costs money, which means the game needs to be successful in order to sustain itself, and it was not a success, and the servers have since been turned off, and you can no longer play the game. But my music still remains. If you go to my website, you can listen to it up there. So a mixed bag, but that's the ups and downs of a career and a life in entertainment as a freelancer. Anybody that does this kind of work has any number of similar stories, so I'm not unique in that regard. But I'm very proud of the work that I've done on all 4 of these games, and hope to continue to do a lot more work like that in the future. So before we dive into my work, I want to give a brief overview about the way music in games works, both in the past and in the present, and how it's kind of evolved. And I hope this is interesting. So a brief history of video game music. Back then, here's a classic scene of an American family enjoying Super Mario Brothers on the Nintendo Entertainment System out of Japan. The Nintendo was not the first video game console, but certainly was the start of the modern phenomenon of video games as one of the major pillars of entertainment. It had been years, decades since there had been a big revolution. The last one was probably talking motion pictures, and color were probably the last great sea changes in entertainment before video games came along. Maybe a bold opinion, but there's kind of people my age and maybe a couple years older and certainly younger. There is really no world that exists where video games aren't a part of our lives. And of course, as time goes on, it just becomes more and more normalized for people. So the Nintendo is really the big thing that broke it open for the general public, I would say. I love this picture, by the way. I love the fact that I don't know whose parents those are, but no kids that I knew in the 80s had parents that were really excited about watching their kids play video games. My parents in particular refused to even let me have a Nintendo. They said, "You're not going to have anything hooked up to the television. It's going to keep you inside any more than you already are. Get outside and get some exercise." And ironically, given my choice of career, their precautions didn't really take root, but they're very supportive of my life and career, so it all worked out for the best. Anyway, so this is, a 30-something-year-old game, 35 at this point. And so how did we get from the music of this game, which is iconic for certain generations of people, how did we go from this like I said, an iconic piece of music for people probably 40 and under, to something like this, which is from last year.
PlayStation.
So pretty cool. That was from an awards show that took place about a year ago called the Game Awards. They've been putting on that show for maybe 5, 6 years now, maybe a little longer, 7 or 8. It happens every December and presents awards to for all sorts of different categories, from best music, best game, game of the year, all that kind of stuff. It's an award show, and it's also used to make big announcements. So that was actually an announcement for a game called Ghost of Tsushima. All that imagery on the screen behind the orchestra was from the video game. It's not live action. I mean, it looks incredible, especially when you compare it to this, these flat graphics on this tube television. So it's obviously a massive event. This huge auditorium here in Los Angeles with thousands of people. They have got this big budget, hiring a full orchestra to replicate the sound of the music that's in the game. I mean, that is one-to-one, music that you would hear while you're playing the game. And it's a far cry from, the Super Mario Brothers theme song that we just heard before that. So, how did we get here? Well, let's talk a little bit about that. On consoles like the Nintendo, the way sound and music was played back was that there was actually a chip inside the console itself that was capable of playing a very limited range of synthesized sounds. In fact, it originally could only play 4 different types of sounds. Towards the end of its life cycle, it was able to play a 5th one. But the primary kind of sound sources were these 4 channels. There were 4 synth waveforms. There were 2 pulse waves or square waves, 1 triangle wave, and 1 noise channel, which is white noise basically. And then towards the end of that, like I said, towards the end of the console's life cycle, the technology got a little more sophisticated, and they were able to play back a very, very low resolution, low bit rate sample. So you could potentially have some real world recordings in there, but it was, it had to be so short and it sounded so crunchy and distorted, but pretty high tech for the time. The music itself, we heard that Super Mario Brothers theme. It all kind of sounded like that because that's all this chip was really capable of. There was no polyphony. You couldn't have harmony except among these 3 channels, but you couldn't have a chord playing across one channel, which is why you get that sort of frenetic sound of arpeggios running all up and down the scale, and it's very high energy. And part of that is you're playing a game, you want to keep players interested, but part of that is the limitations of the software. You can only play 4 sounds at once. Generally, the way it broke down was, those 2 pulse waves were some form of harmony. So instead of chords, just crazy arpeggios outlining chord changes. A second pulse wave would be a melody. The triangle wave, because the nature of a triangle wave sound would generally be a bass part or a counterpoint line. And then the noise channel would kind of take care of everything else. So you could use it for sound effects like sweeping across, frequencies, or generally the most common use was as percussion. Depending on the decay of the sound, you could make it sound like a snare drum with some reverb on it, or it could kind of sound like a kick drum or a hi-hat, and you sort of put those all together and get a little crafty and build a little noise drum kit. And that was it. Kind of amazing that people were able to write iconic pieces of music that anybody, I think if you asked anybody under 40 to hum the Super Mario Brothers theme song, they'd be able to do it as easily as Happy Birthday or the Star Wars theme or something like that. It's that iconic. And to think that these people wrote this stuff with these kinds of limitations is pretty remarkable. So the Nintendo wasn't the only console like that out there, although it was the most common. One of the more advanced ones was the Commodore 64, which was sort of a hybrid. I mean, depending on who you talk to, it was one of the first examples of an affordable home PC, or it was a more advanced version of a video game console compared to a Nintendo. And it's both of those things. The onboard sound chip was called the SID chip, or sound interface device. And it was similar to the Nintendo's sound chip, except it had more advanced features in terms of how it would modulate the waveforms and filters, and it's just slightly more sophisticated. But in order to write music for that, we have such sophisticated ways of making music at home now. I mean, everybody's phone is capable of doing incredibly advanced recording production. I mean, more advanced than most studios were even 20 years ago. It's unbelievable what you can do with a phone nowadays. But back then, in order to write music on a computer, you had to use a program that was called a tracker. So this is an example of a tracker. This is actually running on a Commodore 64. It's not my piece of music. This is something I found on YouTube. It's a program called Goat Tracker, but this is very indicative of what writing music would have been like for a Commodore 64 back then, or even a Nintendo. The easiest way to describe it is that it's kind of laid out like a spreadsheet. There's horizontal and there's vertical rows and columns. And the way you write music is kind of like programming in data. You enter note values, you enter durations of the note value. This is a very simplified way of thinking about it, but you had to kind of manually enter things into these little rows and columns, and then you would hit go, and it would scroll down the column and play your music back for you. So let's actually take a look at what this piece of music is that this person wrote in a tracker. So you get the idea. I mean, to sort of keep a creative idea in your head long enough to deal with having to put it into that sort of format, it just seems mind-boggling to me. And it was very common for a very long time that if you wanted to get a job as not even just as a composer, but working in game audio in general, or any game at all on these old consoles, you had to have a computer science degree, because it's just as much programming type of skills as it is creative skills. I'm thankful that we're not in that era anymore, because I don't have a computer science background. But I do, have enough of an understanding of the way things work under the hood to communicate with programmers and software engineers when necessary. But that was how music was written for a very long time. As consoles evolved from the Nintendo into the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis and some of these other ones, the core of how sound worked in those consoles was essentially the same. The chips in them got more sophisticated. They were able to play back more channels, more samples, but you were always limited by the sound chip in the hardware itself in terms of what the sound and music would be like. Until in 1995, Sony entered the game market with the Sony PlayStation. So Sony, of course, was and is a massive company. A big chunk of its business was consumer electronics. And this was seen as a very risky ploy back then, because at the time, games were pretty much, there was a couple other smaller competitors, but essentially it was Nintendo and it was Sega, both Japanese companies that made consoles, and those were kind of the only two that were really competing for market share. And it was a big risk for Sony to jump in, having no background whatsoever in game development, both on the software side and especially on the hardware side. But they had hardware expertise, and I think they believed in themselves enough to say, hey, this is worth the risk, and of course it's paid off tremendously. So the big change with the PlayStation, of course, was that games now came on a CD-ROM and not on a cartridge. All of these systems, and just about every system before, were limited by cartridges that had all of the sort of memory ROM information, physically in a little plastic thing that you had to insert into the box. And if you couldn't fit it in that little plastic cartridge, it wasn't going in the game. And looking back now on the specs of what these people had to work with in terms of memory size and all that kind of, it's just shocking that they were able to make any sort of experience that was worth spending time playing with such limitations. CDs, of course, can hold tremendously larger amounts of information, and the biggest advantage from a musical and audio perspective is that instead of being limited by a sound chip in a piece of hardware, you can now play back anything that's pre-recorded via Redbook audio, right? So I'm sure you all know, Redbook is the standard way of storing audio information on a CD. And so these took advantage of that. So once, all of the other game information, the graphics and the gameplay and the animation and everything was all put on the disc, whatever was left over was the amount of memory that you had for sound and music. But the great advantage of that is that you could record whatever you wanted, and this was really the dawn of when things like fully orchestral scores were were a possibility, and you could replicate more cinematic experiences like you're used to in movies and television with more sophisticated music than the sort of cartoony beeps and boops that you were limited to in the past. So this was a great advancement for the industry and for creativity that continues to evolve to this day. So this is a quick snapshot of something that we're going to talk about later. This is an example of modern interactive music implementation in specialized software that is designed specifically for playing back music and sound effects in a game in 2020. This is a very common piece of software that anyone who's an audio professional will be at least marginally aware of. And I've got a whole example that I'm going to demonstrate later of an interactive music system using this. But this is, light years beyond that initial sort of tracker Super Mario Brothers sound. And it's amazing how far we've come in the 35 years since then. So let's do a little bit of a case study in how I personally write music for one of my big projects. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the games that I spend most of my time working on is called Guild Wars 2. And the setting of the game is, a fantasy role-playing kind of game, Dungeons and Dragons-ish, Lord of the Rings, kind of pseudo-medieval with magic involved, that kind of typical fantasy setting. And one of the pillars of the game is its art. So this is a piece of promotional art that was used when the game was launching in 2012. This is a screenshot from within the game, and you can see it's, these beautiful environments, grand sort of vistas and interesting characters, cool armor. It's very art forward. It's one of the creative pillars of the game. And fortunately for me, one of the other creative pillars of the game is music. I'm not the first composer for the game. I came in after someone else had been working on the franchise, both Guild Wars 1 and then the initial version of Guild Wars 2 that launched in 2012. But since that game came out in 2012, they've continued to release additional content for it to keep players engaged, within the game world. And all of that new content needs new music. And I've been very fortunate to transition from my initial job at the studio as a sound designer, strictly doing sound effects, into taking over the music full-time in 2012. And at this point, I've forgotten how many hours of music I've written for the game, but it's a very large number, and I'm very grateful for that. So the music itself, as you might imagine from seeing these kinds of things, is similarly sort of lush and beautiful. It's orchestral based music. It's grand sweeping melodies, and it sounds like a film score is essentially what its aesthetic is supposed to reflect. Is the kind of Lord of the Rings-ish genre. But before we get to the end product, we have to start with the blank page. The most intimidating thing in all of in every creative field is that blank page, and that's how every single new thing starts. So when I'm faced with the blank page, how do I like to work? Well, game development is not exactly like an assembly line. It's similar, but instead of it being, the person before you does their job, then hands it off and you do your job, there's a little bit of that, but there's more overlap. So a lot of stuff is being developed concurrently. Audio and music is definitely one of the last stages, much like post-production is in film and television, because you have to kind of wait for the whole picture to be assembled. But music especially, because it's a little bit more ephemeral and less tied to what's happening in the game moment to moment, there's a chance to start working on it earlier to develop ideas for themes and, sonic textures and that kind of thing, what the sort of musical palette will be. So early on, I'll generally get a lot of concept art. Concept art is one of the first things that starts any sort of part of the production cycle. Is we have to imagine it first, and what would we imagine this part of the game would be like if we didn't have any sort of creative restrictions. Well, the studio has an incredible roster of virtuosic artists and illustrators and painters who I'm in awe of their talent. And they'll work with the writing team and the narrative team to come up with a setting that they're going to work on for the next whatever several months, year, couple of years, and just imagine what it would feel like. It's all about like I said, it's all about concepting. So it doesn't have to be tied to the technical restrictions of making a game. It's just like in a perfect world, what would this look like? What would it feel like? And this is an example of a desert city. A couple of years ago, we released some content for the game that took place in kind of a fantastical version of Morocco or North Africa or quasi-Arabian fantasy setting. And so here's an example of a city that you might find on the banks of a sea, tucked against a ridge of mountains. Beautiful. I mean, you look at a picture like this and you just immediately get a sense of, what that must feel like to kind of walk up a hill and maybe be faced with this vista, stunning beauty at the golden hour. I don't know. It's just, in my mind, it already starts conjuring up little fragments of melodies and certain instrumentation. So I look at a lot of concept art. And then I'll also talk with designers and writers and talk about the arc of the story that they're trying to tell in this setting. And their sort of concern is really about plot details and little nuts and bolts stuff that moves the story along. I'm a little more interested in the high level view of it, in terms of what emotions do you want players to feel at different parts of the story? Who are important characters? What are important moments in the plot that really need accentuating with music? So between the concept art, the narrative team, and maybe some additional art like this, gives you a sense of what a denizen of this particular city might look like, might be wearing. It just gives you a sense of the culture, and how life feels in that area. And again, an image like this combined with some of these concept art pieces will immediately give me a sense of what the music should feel like. So again, this is obviously this kind of Moroccan, North African setting. So, there's a shorthand for that type of music without delving too much into cliched, old notions of what the Middle East sounds like. There are certain strong characteristics that I like to draw on and incorporate into the existing sound of Guild Wars, which is that classic kind of fantasy Western orchestral sound. So that's the inspiration. Next step is to go into the software and just start working. I mean, a lot of this stuff is really just putting in the sweat, blood, tears, a lot of that. So in my piece of software, I use a program called Cubase, which is pretty common for writing music, using virtual instruments to produce it all. I have a template that every project starts out with. I've got all my instruments laid out. You can see on the left side there, this is the woodwind section. I've got them all laid out the same way that they're laid out in a traditional classical music score, so that it's easy to conceptualize a piece. It's just a good frame of reference for, the way this music has been studied and published for hundreds of years. The more you kind of reflect that, it makes the front start to finish version of the process easier when we finally get to, say, printing scores and actually recording the stuff with a live orchestra. So here's a quick scroll through my template, and you can get a sense of what I have to look at every day. This is a project that this is a piece I'd already completed. So here you've got the woodwinds. Here's the brass section in blue, darker blue. This is percussion, and then we move to more percussion, harps, pianos. The purple is strings, and then at the bottom there, let's go back. Oh boy, at the bottom here. We've got choir over here. Ensembles are kind of a pre-baked combination of certain orchestral instruments that are good for sketching. It's just makes it easier when, it's easy to sort of shorthand in a couple of ideas before you start fleshing out the orchestration. And then synths. So this is kind of my core template. I have things routed in certain ways so that it goes to different reverbs and just, all the tricks of the trade that you learn trying to produce this music virtually to get it to sound as real as possible. This is my day-to-day is looking at something like this. All of these chunks here, these bars of whatever, are the MIDI data. So like I said, this piece of music is already completed. This is actually me scoring a video up here, as you can see. in a more traditional manner, like traditional film and television scoring. It's a linear piece of video that I'm writing music to, which we'll hear the final version later. Um, yeah. Next, if you're lucky and you have time and budget, which you don't always do, but hopefully you get a chance to record this stuff live. I would say my work on Guild Wars is maybe 60-40 virtual versus live, because it's a successful game and a successful studio, but we don't have Sony money to hire an orchestra for everything. And so you have to get really good at using virtual instruments and trying to make them sound real. And fortunately, there are some unbelievably sophisticated sample libraries out there, and with some work and learning what they do well and what they don't do well, you can make some very realistic sounding pieces of music. And it's also not uncommon to blend the two, to record some live stuff and layer it over sampled music, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. But this is a concert hall and a recording hall, I guess. It's not really a studio, but I've had the pleasure of working in this place. It's in a town called Frankfurt in Germany, and it's not the main Frankfurt that most people know. There's a second city called Frankfurt that's kind of near the Polish border in the former Eastern Germany. A very sleepy little town, but there's an orchestra there that all the people in the orchestra actually on salary, and I think it's a state-run orchestra. So it's their full-time job to play in this group. And this is their concert hall that was built in the 1200s, if I'm not mistaken. It's probably had some work done on it over time. It certainly looks like it from the bricks. But the original structure was built in the 1200s, and now it's been transformed from the church that it was originally into a concert hall and a recording venue. So this is looking out into the hall, and then this is from the same vantage point, me looking down onto the stage where the orchestra was playing my music. And this moment that you get to first hear your music played by real people in a beautiful hall, these people are unbelievably talented, is truly magic. I mean, it takes months to get to this point, and it's a lot of work. Not just from the creative standpoint, but from the technical standpoint of producing the scores, literally printing them out and getting them on the stands in front of people, and all that stuff it takes a lot of people. It's not just me. And when the conductor kind of plays or signals that first downbeat, and they start playing it, it just gives me chills every time. It makes all those months of agony worth it. And so in this situation, this is not uncommon, where we've got almost a complete orchestra here, but it's not the whole thing. I don't believe on this session we had any percussion, because a lot of modern media music is so percussion heavy, and it's really difficult to record live percussion and orchestra at the same time, because if you don't get it exactly right, then the balance can be way off. And so percussion is such a dominating sound that it's much more common and much easier in the long run to record it separately, and then mix it back in. So we were just recording the kind of core orchestra here. We had a full string section, a woodwind section, a brass section, and a harp player live. And then we would layer in some orchestral percussion like a timpani and cymbals and that kind of thing. And for this particular track, we had to get some specialized percussion, or exotic percussion. So this is a picture of a percussionist here in Los Angeles named Brian Kilgore, who's one of the premier people. I mean, he's played on so many movies and TV shows going back decades. He's really the cream of the crop. He's one of the first call people for the biggest sessions in town. Very nice guy, incredible percussion player, and one of his specialties is kind of world percussion. So you can see in this picture he has a collection of really interesting drums from all over the world. I mean, just looking at what's in this picture, there's stuff from Asia and Africa and South America. If it's weird and makes a cool sound, you can hit it. He probably has at least one of them, if not four. And this is actually at his home studio. So what happened was I wrote that piece of music that we saw in the software earlier. We recorded the orchestra live, but then it needed this extra layer of percussion on top of it. So, this could be days, weeks, or even months after the fact. I sent him an email. I got in touch with him. I sent him an email and said, hey, are you free to record some percussion coming up soon? He said yes. And so I went to his home studio, and we spent a whole day, 8 hours, just tracking layer by layer percussion. The advantage of doing it live is, he probably has instruments that I don't have samples for. In fact, I know that he does. And then, of course, adding that element of humanity. There are times even where I have a fully produced track that's orchestral that I've done only in my studio with samples, and then I have drums and stuff back here. I'm not as good as Brian, but if I don't have the time or money, I've got just put a microphone in front of it and I can bang something out that sounds pretty good. And just adding that one human element to something that's completely synthetic and in the box can really give it life that it wouldn't have otherwise. And then, of course, in a perfect world, you get to do it all live. So I want to play an example of a percussion track from this video that I'm going to show you at the end of all this. My original samples version, which is what I was using when I was writing it, and then the live version. And you can hear how they differ. The obvious difference is that with the samples, it's easier to just kind of write a loop, 2 bars or 4 bars of something, and copy and paste it, because I don't have time to sit there and program every single little hit on a drum and then layer 8 of those together to make it to give it the size and scope that I want it. I just don't have time for that level of intricacy. So it's much more common to just kind of take some loops and throw them in there. And then when you get into a situation with a live player, you can say, hey, here's the general feel, but at measure 16, can you build that? Can you play a little fill as we transition into the next section? And they just get it, and it saves you so much time on the back end, and the end result is so much stronger. So let's take a listen. The first is the sampled version. So that was an example of the different layers, right? It starts and ends with all of it playing together, and then I kind of broke it out so you could hear each individual drum. And they sound good, sometimes that's passable, depending on how the density of the orchestration and the arrangement. Sometimes you don't need more than a loop, but it's still a little robotic. It's just the same pattern over and over again. Also, that's just like soaked in reverb, and reverb is a great spackle for covering up things you don't want people to notice musically, certainly. And it's very thick and dense, and it's a little muddy sounding to me, and it's just because in that situation it doesn't have the right feel, with just a few layers, and so you put more and more and more on, and then it gets a little busy, and it's not great. So the live version of that is much simpler, and yet I think it's more effective. So here's the live version. So you can hear, it's a lot roomier sounding. I mean, in the final mixing stages, we would put some additional reverb on it and get it to blend well with the orchestra. But there's only a handful of parts. Some of the sampled percussion parts I might layer in there just for spice, or because he didn't have a certain drum that I really like the sound of. But the core of it is really about that humanity. And, I'm not saying, hey, I want you to replicate the samples exactly. It's like, here's the general drums and sonic palette that I use, and say, oh, well, I have this, and I think this would work really well in that context. And he knows his instrument and his palette that he can work with much better than I do, and I'll always defer to the expert in that situation. Additionally, there are specialized soloists that occasionally we need. So again, because this is a quasi Middle Eastern setting, I wanted an instrument called a duduk on top of the orchestra. This is actually not the person that I recorded for my own music. I don't have any pictures of that person, unfortunately, so I just found this off of Google, but it probably was very similar to this. A duduk is kind of an ancient version of an oboe, is really the easiest way to describe it. It's a reeded instrument that has its origins in the Middle East and Armenia and Turkey and that sort of Central Asia and North Africa. Very common instrument. It's been around for a very long time. It's a very beautiful and haunting kind of sound, and the way it's played idiomatically is it's a very expressive instrument. Has a plaintive quality to it, like close to the human voice, maybe a very nasal human voice, but people who are experts at playing it can play it beautifully. So this is an even more stark example of the difference between my samples and the live version. My samples just include me, it's just me improvising with a Duduk sample library over the music. And I'm a terrible piano player and an even worse piano improviser. But it gets the point across in terms of what I'm going for. And then what I would do with a live player is I wouldn't even write notes on the score. I would maybe write a couple pitches that I say, hey, can you keep the notes you're playing within this sort of range, and then just improvise something that feels like this. And especially with such specific exotic and ethnic instruments like this, they know how to play it so much better than I do, and they know what I want, and they'll hear the mock-up version and just go nuts, and it's night and day compared to my crappy sample version. So let's take a listen. So the music itself is really simple, and it really relies on that part to carry it, because it's kind of just droning along underneath it with a little bit of percussion to give it some energy and forward momentum. And in certain contexts that might have been good enough, but in my mind it's pretty dull and boring, and certainly not very expressive. So this is the same exact piece of music, but with a live Duduk player playing over top of it. So you can hear it's just, it's so much better. And all of that was improvised by the player. And I don't even think I gave them feedback. I think they gave me 4 or 5 takes that they had done just off the cuff. And I assembled a couple of them together in an arc of phrases that I liked. But they made all that up and, just elevated that piece of music, because it's so reliant on that instrument to carry it and have it not just be sort of something dull droning along. So let's hear all of that all put together. This is the video from that session I was showing you in Cubase earlier. Essentially what's happening is this is kind of the start of your adventure. So you begin at the start of this video in the normal setting for Guild Wars 2, which is fantasy land, and you get in this airship, which is what this blob is in the middle. It's kind of a Zeppelin-looking thing, and you traverse across, different biomes in the land that the game takes place in. Eventually, traversing across a large body of water, and then you land on the shores of this desert, Moroccan-ish, North African area. And so the music has to kind of transition from the, fantastical orchestra into something a little bit more exotic. And it utilizes all that stuff I just mentioned between sampled percussion and instruments, live percussion, live exotic soloists. So yeah, let's take a listen. It's pretty short. So that's a pretty good example of Guild Wars music. In terms of complexity, it's not the most advanced. A lot of times the music in the game is just kind of on a random sort of shuffle playlist, and will be triggered by the player entering different areas of a map. The game will say, hey, the player just entered this map. Let's pick one of 5 particular tracks that are associated with this area at random, play that piece of music, let it end, maybe a minute or 2 goes by. Let's choose another one from that same list, minus the first one we just played, and that it'll just cycle through that. That's very, basic and very common method of music implementation in that type of game. And it doesn't really need anything more sophisticated than that. It's just kind of there to set the mood for the players. However, games have advanced significantly, and certainly some of the most advanced games have more complex and interesting music systems in them. And that's what I want to talk about next. So let's talk about interactive music. I call it the great differentiator because interactive music is what truly separates video games as an art form and a medium from things like film and television. Even though, it utilizes the same methods of production for music, certainly, and the end product might sound very similar to a movie or a TV score. Those are traditional media, and traditional linear media specifically, where, in a film scene that might need music, you come in, the scene starts, music comes in, you have A, B, C, D emotional beats that you want to hit along the way, and then you write the music to reflect that, and then you get to the end, music fades out or cuts off, and that's the end of that scene. And when it's approved by the director, you go record it, and you're done. And it never changes, right? You can watch Star Wars 1,000 times, and the music will always start and end, and it'll be the same every single time you watch it. If you are working on a Star Wars game, however, there is a structure to how the game's story is told, but the big X factor is that so much of it is reliant on the player's behavior. And so you might say, this level is designed for a player to start off here. You load into the level, you look around, you walk forward, you turn left, you turn right, you walk down a hill. And, you can say that's how things should go. But if the player is a wild card, which most of them are, you can't anticipate their behavior from moment to moment. So the player might load into the map, and they might turn around and just walk the other direction, or they might go right instead of left. And you have to kind of anticipate all those scenarios happening and set up the music system of the game to reflect different player choices and react instantaneously and seamlessly. And it makes writing soundtracks for games much, much more complex than writing music for television or movies by an order of magnitude, in my opinion. And to me, it's what makes the medium interesting, and the creative possibilities, I think are much greater because there's so much unexplored in terms of producing music that way, whereas film and television are kind of set in their ways. I mean, the sonic palette might change depending on what's in vogue every few years, but the way it's done hasn't changed in a very, very long time. So let's talk a little bit more about interactive music. First, let's talk about game engines. So a game engine is a term that's used for, the easiest way to describe it is it's essentially the entire framework that the game runs on. So everything from the software that renders the 3D animations to the lighting to it plays back, the music. It is the artificial intelligence of an enemy that you're fighting against. A game engine is the catch-all term for what game software actually runs in, similar to Windows or a Mac operating system. It's like the game's little mini operating system. The 2 most common ones are listed here. So Unreal is probably the biggest one, and then Unity is maybe the second biggest one. Unreal is typically used for more AAA. We call them AAA titles. AAA just means the highest level production values. So biggest budgets, biggest expectations in terms of sales. And those are the ones that really push the limits of what games are capable of year to year. And they get more expensive. The budgets for some of these high-end games are just crazy, insane, in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And Unreal is an extremely sophisticated game engine, and so you pay the company that makes it a license fee, and then you have access to this toolbox where they've solved a lot of problems for you. Unity is similar, but typically used for smaller scale projects, and there's, much like movies have big budget films and indie films, games have big budget games and indie games, and so Unity is much more common in the indie game crowd with smaller teams. Sometimes even a single person will make an entire game in it, and it's much more friendly both from a licensing cost standpoint and a usability standpoint for smaller scale experiences. Within the game engine, there's another type of software that we call audio middleware. And it's called middleware because it's a bridge between the software that we use to produce audio and record music and record sound effects and the game engine, which is the sort of final software step in the process. When working on a game, if you're the person in charge of the money and the production schedule, you have to sort of weigh, do I have the software engineering talent to reinvent the wheel and solve some of these problems from scratch, or is it easier for me to just pay a license to a company that has a very sophisticated version of the software that I need and integrate it into the game engine and say, okay, we're done with that. We don't need to worry about any surprises along the way. And these are the two most common versions of audio middleware. The one on the left is called Fmod, and then the one on the right is called Wise. Some people call it WWise, but I'm pretty sure it's just pronounced Wise. And like the previous game engines, Fmod tends to be used a little less frequently than Wise, but they're kind of like Pepsi and Coke. I mean, they're both the same thing. Wise is maybe 51% more common in the game industry, and that's what I'm going to be demonstrating after this. But it's an unbelievably sophisticated bit of software that can control all of the audio in the game, from the voiceover dialogue to all of the sound effects and to the music. And you can get pretty simple, like Guild Wars 2 with it, or you can get unbelievably sophisticated. And I'm going to try to show off a little bit of the more sophisticated side, or at least give a high-level overview of it. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of interactive music systems. There's generally two ways of thinking about interactive music. There's horizontal and there's vertical. So first I want to talk about a horizontal music system. What I mean by horizontal is that it progresses linearly through time, right? So you have these three chunks of music, A, B, and C. And as time progresses, on the left there, you're going to see, it fades in, it plays chunk A, and then it'll seamlessly crossfade into chunk B when the time comes, when the game engine decides a player's action warrants it to switch from music A to music B. It will happen seamlessly. As a player, you won't even notice it. It's not like, it depends on how it's written and implemented, but it's generally supposed to be seamless and not draw any attention to itself. And then, of course, B will fade into C, and that can go on to D, E, F, and all the way back around. And then when it's time for that music piece to end, it will fade out. This is a very, very simplified but pretty common example of horizontal music. All those pieces of music will be conceived and written as if they were a single, meant to be experienced in a single sort of linear fashion, I guess. But like I said, you are at the behest, or you're at what's the term I'm looking for? You are not a slave, but you're you're in the hands of the player, and so the player's actions dictate how the music plays back. So something like this might happen where music chunk A might play when you first load into a map, but then you spend the next 10, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes just exploring the map constantly. And in that situation, that chunk B, that middle chunk, might be on a loop because you've never met the conditions in the game that will trigger music C. And within that loop, of chunk B, you might have micro variations like B1, B2, B3 that provide a little bit more variety, so it doesn't just sound like you're hearing the same 30 seconds of music over and over again. But but it'll be similar enough that it just kind of feels like we're vamping on this chunk of music before some condition is met that will lead you to music C. Again, very basic version of a horizontal music system. The other kind of music system is vertical music. It's a different way of thinking about things. With vertical music, you can kind of think about it like a traditional recording console will have multiple tracks. And in this situation, the game engine will be like a mix engineer sitting behind that console, pushing different faders up on different tracks. So, you walk into a map and you hear tracks A and B playing at the same time. And that might be a low synth pad with maybe some light percussion on top of it just to give some energy. But what you don't hear is that there's tracks C, D, and E playing at the same time, theoretically, but they're muted, right? So when certain conditions are met in the game, it will unmute those tracks. So let's say you're starting to explore the map and you come across a secret staircase. All of a sudden, track C will fade up. And that could be, a brass section playing, the French horns playing some kind of melodic figure. And then you progress further down this staircase and it takes a turn, and then all of a sudden a valley opens up before you, right? And you get this beautiful sweeping vista of this valley. And then all of a sudden track D will fade up, and that could be the violins playing a big soaring melody over top of this horn counterline. And then, you continue to traverse down the stairs, and all of a sudden you're on the valley floor and you're looking at this beautiful ancient city or maybe some ruins before you. And the final bit of music will come up, and maybe it's a choir. The music reaches this big crescendo. Every track is playing. It's epic, and you're just in awe of this beautiful kind of ruined city that you see before you. That's the easiest way to think about music in a vertical sense. All of those tracks are all playing at the same time, and they're written and implemented in a way that they can all be playing, or different chunks of them will be playing. And you have to kind of set the criteria of what will turn up those different tracks. And then when the player meets those criteria in the game, the engine will sort of take over and turn them up or down. The most complicated systems are combinations of both of those things, right? So if we're looking at this vertical music system, this could be, chunk A of a piece of music, and chunk B might be just as complex, and chunk C, D, E, F, and you can see how quickly the complexity can kind of spiral out of control, and it takes a very meticulous and detailed plan to conceive of music in this way, and make sure that you don't get in over your head during the production cycle. Not every game is this complex, but I would say it's becoming more and more common. And the expectations of players expect things to be this dynamic and interactive, even on mobile games sometimes. It's very sophisticated, and it's just the normal way of working in interactive game audio, and you just kind of have to wrap your mind around these types of systems. So next I want to actually demonstrate this. It's much better than talking about it. Let's take a look at a very basic interactive music system. Okay, here is a pretty simple example of an interactive music system that I've already set up. So this is Wise, the program that I'm running. It looks a little complex. It still, confuses me from time to time when I'm looking at it. But it's one of those things where it's kind of a Swiss Army knife, and I don't need all the functionality that this software has from moment to moment. And you have to kind of, get some tunnel vision sometimes when you're working in it and say, don't pay attention to that. I just need this. So this is over here. You can see, there's all this other sort of branching stuff, but basically I've already set this up, this interactive music hierarchy. And within that is this dynamic music test, and within that is the combat music test. So this was for a project that was being made by the studio that makes Guild Wars 2. It was a science fiction game. It was going to be a pretty big departure for the studio. Unfortunately, it was canceled, which I regret, because it would have been really cool, I think, if they had decided to make it, and I was looking forward to writing the music for it. But in the run-up to, in the pre-production phase before it was canceled, I sat down with the audio department, and we were talking about how we wanted the music and the audio to be different than Guild Wars and be a little bit more sophisticated, a little more interactive. And I set up this combat music demo to both learn how to use this software more effectively and also to demonstrate some of the possibilities to the studio about with the ways music might sound during a fight encounter in the game. So underneath this combat music test, you'll see all these different kind of sub entries, and these are all different states that you might find yourself in a fight in the game. So you've got alert, which is, you know, when the fight is about to start, just to kind of set the tension. It'd be a transition from the lighter ambient music into combat music. Then you've got these 3 different stages of intensity, depending on how the fight's going to go. So low, medium, and high. It's pretty self-explanatory. There's an outro stinger, which is the final punctuation you might hear at the very end of the fight to let you know that the fight is over, basically, without just turning it off or fading it out. And then these 2 transitions, which these are designed to just smooth. I mean, they're transitions. It seems pretty obvious. They're designed to smooth the transition between a couple of the different states, just so that it's not so robotic in terms of like, now we're in low, now we're in high, you know. And so this is very basic, but these are all very common scenarios that you would find yourself in over the course of any sort of combat encounter in any game, really. Within these, if I kind of expand them, you can actually see how it's broken out. And going into too much detail here, I think, would not be wise, pun intended. I'll point you to some places where you can learn a little bit more about how these things work and how they're set up if you're really curious. But I think it's just important to know that underneath these different states are things like this, right? So this is where this software actually starts to look a little bit more like a familiar piece of digital audio software. This alert state is very basic. It just plays this one track, and it loops between the green and the red markers here. There's a little bit of a fade out here at the end of the red marker, so when it would transition out of this state, you know, it'll play this little last chunk and pull the fader down virtually so that it's not so jarring just switching from one to another. But let's just take a listen to what this chunk sounds like. So it's very simple. It's just 2 measures of that over and over again. In the game, it would just loop, and that's fine. That's all you need, because realistically, you're probably not going to hear more than, you know, I'm going to say 5 seconds of that before a fight might get more intense. So it doesn't need to be the most interesting thing. It just needs to set the tone for the rest of the encounter. Something like combat low, let's say that's the next state that you enter. You can see here there's combat low A and combat low B. And what these are 2 little micro variations of the same thing, right? And just to give it a little bit more spice, the game will choose randomly when it gets to this state, when it's going to transition into combat low, it'll choose either A or B completely at random, and then as it's looping it, it'll loop randomly from A to B, or maybe it'll do A twice and then B and then back to A and then B twice. Again, just to provide some variety so that it doesn't sound like you're hearing the same piece of music over and over again. So A has that same layer of percussion we heard in the alert state down here, and B has a bass, like pulsing bass added to it to give it some, you know, a little bit more intensity. So let's listen to combat low A. Very simple, right? Very simple. So this is 4 measures this time. Up here you can see the measures. Combat low B is basically the same, but adds a little bit of percussion, heavy percussion. So again, very simple, but you know, these loops, these 3 different tracks are things that I would set up in my other bit of software, knowing that I'm going to implement it this way in Wise. And having them broken out this way gives me that flexibility to create, you know, multiple variations of the same state, to just, you know, keep things a little bit, make sure there's a little bit more variety, and keep things interesting. So medium is the same way. I've got 3 versions of this, all roughly the same, just more is more. High, of course, is the same. The outro is, assembled from a couple different pieces any of the different states, alert, low, medium, high, can hit this little outro stinger, and it'll all sound natural. Again, it's all conceived this way beforehand. The transitions are interesting because, originally when I built this system, all I had was the alert state and then the 3 intensity level states and then the outro, and I thought that was going to be enough. And I found that when I was testing it, it was very jarring when it would go from low to medium and medium to high. It just felt too instantaneous. There was nothing sonically to prepare you that things are about to get a little bit more dangerous. So I put together these 2 transitions down here, so transition high and transition medium. And what's interesting about these is that these I actually conceived of and implemented completely within Wwise. I'd already built this whole system, and I had my assets that I had exported from Cubase, and I didn't really want to open that back up and start mucking around in there again. And so in that situation, you can use Wwise like a traditional digital audio workstation. So I took a couple of these elements and processed them and mixed them and matched them in different ways that would give me give me the transition that I wanted without me having to do too much extra work in a separate piece of software. So it took me maybe 10 minutes each to make these, if that, and so these red lines are, volume automation. I kind of hacked up, I had to experiment with the timing of them, and I found that having it be about half a measure was good for the transition high. For transition medium, it's slightly longer. It's about maybe 1.5 measures ish. So they sound like this. Right. So as you're transitioning from one state to another, you would hear that fade in and then hear it fade out, but it would feel musical. It's all happening in time and in tempo with everything else. Same thing with this one. So it's just a little bit of glue between sections. So that's kind of the basic building blocks. I hope that all made sense. Let's do a live demo. Let's go through them all as if it was an encounter in the game, how that might progress and how the game engine might, kind of puppeteer the music system. So let's imagine a scenario where you are a player and you enter into a clearing, and in that clearing there's enemies, in the distance, but there's one of them that's a little closer to you, and that enemy kind of catches sight of you, starts to make its way towards you, and engage you in combat. In that situation, you would hear the alert start to play. Then once you start fighting, it would transition to combat low because you're just facing one enemy. And then as that fight progresses, all of a sudden those other enemies on the periphery say, hey, what's going on over there? They start to come to you, and now all of a sudden you're fighting 5 enemies instead of 1. Well, then it transitions to combat medium. From there, let's say you defeat all 5 of them without dying, and you get a little chance to take a breath, but the fight's not over. So the combat music might transition back to combat low because, you're not fighting, but you're not ready to relax yet. And then all of a sudden, big bangs and, whatever, you hear crashing through the woods in the distance, and all of a sudden a huge, tank of some sort comes rolling out, or, a giant Incredible Hulk looking, enemy rolls out, and you say, uh-oh, this is the final boss for this encounter. This is going to be a lot harder. And at that point, the music will transition into the high intensity state. You do your best to defeat that Hulkish boss, and then you get that outro stinger that tells you, hey, you did it, and the fight's over, and then you can finally relax. So that's kind of a typical arc of a combat encounter, and I'm going to try to replicate it live, and you can hear how it transitions from state to state, how it all happens in tempo and seamlessly, and hopefully be able to put together in your mind the way an interactive music system might work in a game. So here we go. I'm going to trigger the different states down here. We'll start with alert. So you walk out onto that field. all of a sudden the enemy sees you and is coming over. So you're going to hear it switch. This one doesn't have a transition. It's just going to switch instantly. Uh-oh. We're fighting now. Okay, the fight's going along. Now, those enemies in the distance say, hey, what are they doing over there? And they come over, and now you're going to hear a transition. Uh-oh. It's a little more intense. Okay, so you're dealing with these enemies. The tide of battle is in your favor. You take them all out, and now we're going to transition back to low. So, calms down a little bit. Okay, I thought I was done, but maybe I'm not. Now what? Uh-oh. The big boss. What do I hear in the distance? I hear some crashing. Now you're going to hear another transition, and the music's going to get big. Here it comes. Bigger. I mean, your heart's pounding at this point. But fortunately, you're a competent fighter. Everything goes in your favor. You defeat the enemy. And you can breathe. And the fight's over. So yeah, that's a pretty common example of an encounter and how an interactive music system might be implemented in a modern video game. And I hope that was cool and interesting to hear. Okay, back to the presentation. Like I said, I hope that was useful. It's a lot visually to take in, certainly, and explaining it, is tricky. Fortunately, hearing it is easier than talking about it. If you're curious, that's just scratching the surface of how complex these things can get. So there's a couple of useful YouTube links that hopefully will be posted someplace where you can copy and paste them if you're interested. But if not, you can copy them from here. The first one is a presentation that was given by a composer named Olivier de Rivière at the Game Developers Conference a few years ago. The Game Developers Conference is kind of the premier annual gathering of game development professionals in San Francisco to exchange ideas, exchange information. And he gave a talk a few years ago about a game called Remember Me that he was the composer for. And Olivier is just a genius at creating and composing for complex interactive music systems. I mean, the one that I just played was mostly synth based and samples of drums and stuff, and I was able to do all that in my own studio. And it's easy to manage the little parts of it, because I'm the one doing it all myself. Olivier, the soundtrack for this game has some synth elements and samples and stuff, but the core of it is an orchestra, a traditional orchestra. And so he had to conceive of this system that would take advantage of, the complexity of an orchestra, the sonic palette of an orchestra. But, then when it came time to record all this stuff, he's not going in there and putting down a single sheet of music and saying, let's start at measure 1 and we'll end at measure 112. It's broken up into chunks so that it can be implemented in that complex way where you're putting the building blocks together within the software. And, he's got a room full of 100 people and say, okay, we're going to record this 4 measures, and then we're going to stop at the end and let the reverb trail off. And then, okay, we're going to go back and do a variation on those 4 measures, and just, very unbelievably complicated. And he's a genius, I think. Easily the best person I've ever seen speak about interactive music systems in video games. And so that talk, it's only an hour long. I think it's understandable for a non-professional. I hope it is. Certainly, if you made it this far, you can probably understand it. And if you're curious, it's worth watching. The second one is actually a playlist of shorter videos that are between 5 and 10 minutes. that are released by the company that makes Wise, that piece of software we were just looking at. The company is called Audio Kinetic. And on their YouTube channel, they have an amazing in-depth series of tutorial videos that are the 101 and 201 and 301 of how to implement game audio in Wise. And they have more than just music systems. They have playlists for implementing sound effects, implementing dialogue, as complicated as you want. And I use it for reference myself because the software is, like I said, it can do a lot, and I don't, sometimes I just need to remember, like, how do I do this one thing? And they have all sorts of video tutorials that explain it all. So if you really want to dive into the nuts and bolts of that software, I can't recommend it enough. It's an incredible resource, and it's amazing that it's free. And so that's it. I want to say thank you to the New England branch of SMPTE for giving me the opportunity to give this presentation. I want to thank my friend Jason Clifford for thinking of me when it came time to make a suggestion for a meeting topic. I hope that this was valuable and an insight into what it's like to be a composer for video games in 2020. Kind of soup to nuts. On most social media outlets, you can find me at my full name, MacLaine Diemer. If not, you can just Google me. I have a very easy name to Google. You can go to my website, MacLaineDiemer.com. You can get in touch with me there. I'm happy to answer any and all questions for anybody. I'm an open book, and I think that sharing this knowledge is much better than keeping it secret and arcane, even if you are not a professional. I think it's interesting for anyone that's curious about audio and music and the cutting edge of technology. So thank you again. Be well. Take care.